Hi. I have decided to make this video response to the Finnish Bolshevik. The Finnish Bolshevik was asked to look at an anarchist video saying that the Soviet Union was never socialist. Um, so I want to start with that. Now, uh, I commented, and then the Finnish Bolshevik responded, but I want to be clear as to what we mean, what I mean, by socialist. The core definition of socialist is that workers, not some government, workers own and run the means of production and decide their own lives. That is the core of socialism. That is something we all are supposed to agree with. Okay? Somewhere along the lines, the Finnish Bolshevik has redefined this as socialism is when the government takes control of the means of production and then issues edicts that abolishing class, right? Like the government comes in and says class doesn't exist anymore while it makes its decisions, right? Now, in anarchist theory and in real life, I'm going to say, because if you look at China and if you look at the Soviet Union, what ended up happening was workers' councils were abolished, or at least their power was taken away from them. Managers were sent to the factories. These were managers that were bureaucrats that worked for the party, and everything became controlled by the Central Committee or whatever. And that's who ran things. And what happened there and what happens in anarchist theory is that governments always pick winners and choosers, and states always reinforce class relations. They either have a managerial class or they have other forms of hierarchy come in. So instead of having the capitalist investor class, you have party higher ups. Instead of having executives and managers, you have bureaucrats. Okay, they come in and they run the show, and that is in essence the problem. Those are class relations. What's happening here is simply a word game. So later on, I mean, he responded to me with 9 paragraphs, and I'm not going to deal with all the paragraphs, but he says here, for example, um, I mostly care about whether the USSR was socialist and not about other issues. In socialism, the state should eventually own all the means of production, but the state itself was simply merged with society and wither away. So this is a catechism in Marxist-Leninism. It's simply a statement of faith. Obviously, that didn't happen in the Soviet Union, and it didn't happen as it happened in China. The government still exists. There are class relations in China. There were class relations in the Soviet Union. And then the government, well, the Soviet Union did cease to exist, right? The state went on in another form, which is important. I'll come back to that. But the bottom line is states are self-perpetuating and states create class relations. And this idea that we're going to, there's going to be some sort of merger, it never happens. Now, in the case of the Soviet Union, the excuse for that was, well, the United States still exists. There was the white violence, the white terror, the white army. There was foreign interference by both the Wilson administration and European governments, and then they're like, well, we really can't go to full communist until at least the world's major governments go. So there has to be like a simultaneous socialist revolution in Germany and a socialist revolution in the United States before they can go to full communism, right? Uh, I mean, I don't know what to tell you because your words are empty because I know what happened. So when you say stuff like you expect there to be a merger, there is no reason for that to happen. You do correctly say here um, in your criticism. Okay, here's where you ask the question. So, how could the goal be some kind of state control for its own sake? Um, because that's what states do. Go to a Catholic Mass. You know what the Catholic Mass is? The Catholic Mass is the extension of the Roman state. It sought different ways to perpetuate itself until it merged into other entities or became other things. That's the reality. The reality is that governments either can merge into other institutions or try to perpetuate themselves in some other way. That's what they do. Okay. And power for its own sake is a human thing, it is reality. If you don't understand that, you're not grasping politics. Eventually, all states will do this. Okay? In the Soviet Union, as I already mentioned, there are excuses for this, but it happened. It happened. So it failed on its face. And when you start off a video saying stuff like that, ideally the state will take control of the means of production, you're basically admitting that you're wrong. Anyway, let me get into this discussion about Kerensky and whether Kerensky's government was socialist or not. It wasn't socialist in an anarchist sense, certainly. Um, it was reformist, maybe. We could argue about that. The other thing, though, that's important is there was a certain measure of democracy there, and people did vote him into the Duma. Whether or not I personally agree with that, or whether you personally agree with that, isn't the point. The point is Lenin was sent in there um, to really wreck things up by the Germans. That because they wanted Russia out of the war. So that's why I said what I said. I didn't mean to say that Kerensky was the most socialist imaginable. It was more like it was a mildly state socialist, yes, anti um, anti feudalist government. Yes, totally. You're totally correct about that. Um, but the point is, he was elected. Okay, that's the point. And you can't criticize somebody for tolerating capitalism, which is what you're trying to do here, and then later on sing the praises of somebody like Stalin who brought in capitalism, right? I mean, the Koch brothers got rich off of Stalinist Russia. There was a form of capitalism there, though you don't really want to accept it. So I'm just going to move on. Let's see, towards the end. All right, so Kerensky was not the head of government when Lenin arrived. It was still Lvov at the time. All right. Well, we could debate that, but the point isn't who was the head or who wasn't the head. The point is that Lenin led a coup. They replaced that old system with a new one, and they proceeded to do much the same, disappoint soldiers and disappoint farmers, etc. And they basically did the same thing that the other guys did, except worse. I don't know what the discussion's about, really, because in my view, there are different forms of states and different form of governments. I wouldn't say that I like the United States form of government. It's a capitalist state, etc. Is it better than the Soviet Union uh, during those years in the 1920s when Beria was raping women and people were being sent to the gulag? I mean, I think that's pretty much true. So it's a relative statement. So I don't. I mean, that was a state. I'm not suggesting that the Soviet Union came and interrupted something that was fully functional. What I'm simply saying is the impulse that led to the revolution was fundamentally leftist and fundamentally socialist. And that's something that the Soviet Union killed, much the same as, I mean, take, for example, the union impulse in Wisconsin that we got under Obama. The Democrats and Obama killed that. You know, they moved that democratic union pro worker impulse by public sector workers and teachers. They moved that into the electoral realm. I mean, and that's what states do. That's what governments do. So that was my point. You know, my point wasn't to say this was a fantastic thing that existed before the Soviet Union, but it was reflective of populist currents, and it was more responsive to populist currents. The response from the Marxist-Leninists basically it was to unleash Trotsky on people. I mean, I don't. It's a no. It's just you're just making this more complicated than it really is. Finnish Bolshevik. So now on the larger question, I guess returning to that, was the Soviet Union socialist? According to the core definition, they weren't. And I don't see how, you know, I mean, how you can get around that when in the first 20, 30 seconds of your video, you basically admit that it wasn't. Unless you can explain to me what happened exactly. Did the government melt away? I don't think, right? That didn't happen. So I don't know what you're talking about. Now, I should add here, I heard somewhere that China wants to go full communist, right? And I think their target date is 2050 or something like that. So is that going to happen? I guess I'm interested in your thoughts. Is that what you mean by melting away? When the state actually plans for its own demise? Hmm. All right. Talk to you guys later.